Hi, I'm Adam Shepherd.
And I'm Jane McCallion.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast.
Now, data breaches are a CIO's worst nightmare, and when you're looking at the consequences of a data breach, the focus is often on the so-called reputational damage which is inflicted when hackers break into your network and make off with your data.
If businesses don't protect their data, then they'll be breached, which means they'll lose a significant amount of customers, deals will fall through, and nobody will want to partner with them. Or at least this is the claim. But is it actually realistic? While few people would argue that a data breach is a good thing, is the damage to a victim's reputation as bad as the impact on its operations? How worried about reputational damage should businesses actually be?
Here to discuss this issue is Dr. Roshni Huama, Head of Cyber Governance for cybersecurity company Redsift. Rosh, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jane.
Now, before we dive into the topic at hand, could you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Of course. So I have about 20 years working at the intersection between law and technology. I've got 3 law degrees, and my doctoral thesis is on electronic communication provisions in the Companies Act. So a lot of people say, well, what's cyber governance? Because it's not something that many people have heard, but corporate governance is well known and understood to be a way that a corporation and shareholders and investors will protect their money so that it's employed in projects that will return some value so that you have a return on investment. And cyber governance is similar to that. And so what it is it's like, well, budgets are exploding. How do you make sure that you're putting money into projects and products that will add value to the firm, or that you have a return on mitigation so that you're able to, so that firms can make sure that they don't have like shelfware, or that it's adding value in some way.
It's about a responsible attitude to investment in kind of IT and cyber.
Yeah, 100%.
So Rosh, when we look at the consequences of a hack, there's usually a number of key concerns. The first is business operations, whether or not any critical systems have been taken offline, whether services have been disrupted, that kind of thing. And then the next is theft or destruction of any assets, whether that's data, financial assets, or physical goods, the kind of thing that you might see with ransomware, for example. And then the third main consequence is reputational damage. So how is that different from the other two? Because it's quite a clear grouping of the first two, but this seems to be slightly separate.
So I think for reputational damage, the issue is that it's just harder to put a real dollar value on. If you have business operational, you're looking at maybe replacing kit. You've got, hire investigators in. You will have sort of card monitoring afterwards if you've had a data breach, and then litigation, you've got payouts and lawsuits, you've got legal costs, and all of those are known. You can put a dollar figure on them. Reputational is a bit woolly. And so, look, the conversation is, I suppose, in what we're talking about today is that something that businesses really need to worry about?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things that always comes up, like we say, is, reputational damage. But there are companies that have survived really bad breaches and who, probably if you're outside of, us, the kind of IT community, you've probably forgotten about, BA, Equifax, TalkTalk, Marriott, Ashley Madison. I'd personally forgotten about Marriott, and this is my job. How much of an impact has that had in terms of reputation? Has it at all?
So this is where I think we're talking about there's a bit of a mixed bag. So firms, you can demonstrate a clear case to say, well, look, they survived the damage. But that's not to say that in other instances that the damage isn't material. And you certainly don't want to be in a firm where you've let it go. And this might be better if we sort of demonstrate it through like an example, right? So you'll remember the Sony hack that happened when North Korea got in a knot, over like the interview. There was, you had like large dumps of Sony data. They released confidential information. You remember there was a lot of stuff on actor compensation. There was embarrassing email exchanges. One of the key players sent something which was sort of racially insensitive. It led to a few unreleased movies being pushed out into the wild. So reputationally, Sony publicly said, look, we've spent 41 million in investigation and remediation. But then, then there's the loss of investor confidence. So how that's going to impact. You've got, the loss of data that we don't know about, scripts, pitches, movies in development, and all that kind of stuff. But I suppose to the point, they've survived. I think they weathered the storm quite well, because at the time, back when that happened, so it was about 2016, they were able to attribute it to a nation state actor. And I think they looked at the actor, but not the act. And I'm not confident that a firm would be able to weather that storm quite as well in 2020, because the general population are understanding more and more that you do have sophisticated actors, but then you've also got sort of technically sophisticated acts. So stuff where it's the Iran one, where we've seen the documentary on Netflix. So with that, that was a very sophisticated, and it was nation state actors and stuff. But if you have a nation state actor and they're just able to walk in the door, digitally speaking, then it doesn't really matter.
If I can actually bring it back to Sony for a moment. So it's almost with this one, they were kind of lucky, if you like, that North Korea were already, a villain on the global stage. And also that reputationally, it wasn't so much the fact that they got hacked, especially because it was North Korea, but the content that was released that was embarrassing and potentially reputationally damaging. Is that fair?
Yeah. So, look, people lost their jobs, right? So they had their careers and professional lives, they were damaged, particularly the woman who sent the charged emails. And then there was definitely a loss of reputation over the actor's compensation. But it's difficult to attribute a figure to that.
I think for me, one of the other examples of a breach that should by rights have had real weight when it comes to reputational damage is Equifax. Equifax was a hugely impactful and significant breach. The kind of data that was affected, social security numbers, dates of birth, huge swathes of personal information from a huge number of the American population, let alone the overseas and international customers that Equifax had. They had all of that data stolen, and from something that was really quite a preventable attack if they'd had a proper inventory of their IT systems and had everything patched properly in the way that they should have. And you would think that something that significant would have a major impact in terms of reputational damage, but it kind of didn't really. Equifax is still trading, still around, hasn't lost any kind of significant volume of customers, didn't face any kind of sustained censure from anyone outside the tech press. Within 6 months, most of the general population had sort of forgotten about it.
And their stock price is up, 25% compared to the breach. So, they're definitely not been ground into the ground or anything.
So do you think then that's just a reflection on sort of Joe Public not fully understanding how sophisticated the breach is? So just a little bit of kind of education and awareness on that side. But as the consumer becomes more aware of, this is a well-known threat, this is easy to prevent, that will change. Because, I mean, Equifax do seem to have surfed that pretty well, given the egregious, nature of that. And it was like you said, there's, what was it? They didn't have a list of their assets. They didn't do the patching. And there's the patching, like with the NHS. Remember with that with that ransomware deployment.
WannaCry.
Yeah, exactly. That easily could have been prevented by a simple patching.
Well, the NHS is slightly different, and I'm inclined to cut the NHS a little bit more slack in that they don't have the same kind of resources as one of the big three credit monitoring agencies who have, money quite literally to burn, and really should have been more prepared for something like this. But I think it's less to do with an awareness, within the general public, although I think that certainly plays a part. I think the biggest issue is that the general public at large don't really care about data breaches in the way that they probably should. I think because data and data privacy and, data breaches as an idea are so kind of abstract and so far removed from most people's daily lives, they find it quite hard to conceptualize and quite hard to invest in any kind of notions around data privacy and that it's important, Yeah,
I think that there's an element of that, and possibly also like fatigue. If a lot of breaches are happening at the same time, and then there's an element of kind of like, well, actually, the world didn't end, so it's fine. But also, with particular kind of turning attention to Equifax there, there's almost a duopoly in sort of credit rating agencies. It's Equifax and Experian, and Equifax is the biggest in the US. And you can't just start up a new credit rating agency. That's not a thing you can do. So you just kind of have to stick with it. And if they're the big one in the US, they're the big one in the US. Same as Experian is probably the biggest over here. And I think there's an element of that going on. Is that something that you'd agree with, Roche?
Well, so I mean, bluntly,
no. Feel free to disagree.
Yeah, no. So, well, I suppose the thing is that the size of your business, like you said already, look, Equifax are big, they're rich, they've got deep pockets. It wasn't a technically sophisticated attack. And irrespective anyway of the size of a business, directors of a business have a statutory duty to take reasonable care. Now, and I think that's broadly where my concern comes in, is it's like, look, if something is technically sophisticated, it's not reasonably foreseeable, the threat wasn't known, what's more, there's no solution, no court or investors or shareholders, the general public, should beat those guys about the head because of that. So if it's a truly, like if it's a nation state actor and it's a truly sophisticated technical attack, and then we can evidence that, then I think then we should permit that firm some latitude. However, you've got a firm that has deep pockets. It is well known and understood that there should be a list of digital assets. Patching is well known and understood. The solution is well known and understood. Would a reasonable IT director know about the most significant threats? Well, yeah, they should. And would a reasonable IT director know about the proper processes, policies, and practices, right? Yeah, they should. And then if they don't do that, that seems to me to be a minimum. And I don't see why in the future they'll escape liability at a sort of director level, Yeah, it's hard to say. It may be that we haven't prosecuted these cases either sort of in the public forum, so via media properly, and said, look, if something's well known and if a threat is well known and understood and a solution exists, at a minimum that should be deployed. Do you know?
I think there's absolutely something in that, because I think a large part of what people picture when we talk about reputational damage is the idea that you are going to, both as a business and as an IT leader, whoever is at the top of that particular food chain, that you are going to lose trust of your customers, trust of your partners, trust of the general public, and it just doesn't seem to be the case. And I think a large part of why that is because the press and the media and the community at large don't do a good enough job of raking these people across the coals when they have these kind of really fundamental lapses in cybersecurity and these really quite preventable attacks. It's often treated as, oh, this breach has happened, nothing anyone could have done to prevent it, just one of those things, like acts of God kind of thing. And it's really, we should be putting more effort into going, no, this was a really basic flaw, and we shouldn't let whichever CSO or CIO or director was responsible for making the decision not to patch and for ignoring all the advisories, we shouldn't let them forget that.
So you're exactly right, Adam, and I'm nodding furiously at everything you say, which I realise for a podcast isn't so helpful. But yeah, like we mentioned the Equifax breach. Do you remember? I mean, you will remember because it's absolutely your wheelhouse. But remember that Yahoo breach where,
Oh, do I?
Yeah, right? They uncover it in 2014, 2016, they realise its significance. I mean, who sits on a breach for 2 years, And I know that was technically sophisticated, but you had a 2-year run-in time and you did nothing. Okay, so, then they said 500,000. Oh, no, not 500,000, 500 million. 500.
And eventually it was something like 3.6 billion users. It was basically all of their users forever, which was most of the internet at that point.
Yeah, right.
Like, how is Yahoo still in operation? I mean, I know they've been bought out several times, but how has that company not been ritually burnt at the stake?
Eviscerated, right? That's, nothing short of evisceration for those guys. Yeah, I mean, look, they had to take a whopping discount off their sale price to Verizon. It was 350 million was just wiped off that. That is material by anyone's sums, even when you're dealing with the sort of eye-watering figures in the billions. 350 million is not a drop in the ocean.
Not at all. And I think that, for me, is the closest that quote-unquote reputational damage comes to actually being any kind of real consequence for victims of preventable breaches, because the operational consequences of a breach, we've already touched on things like services being offline, things like data being stolen, or bank accounts being siphoned, all of that kind of stuff. Again, that has a very measurable material impact. And Travelex, for example, is a very good example. They got hit by a ransomware attack late last year, which left their exchange services, offline for months on end. And they have now gone into administration. But it's not because of the reputational damage. It's because their trading was severely impaired for months. It had an operational impact. And I think the only place where the reputational damage has an impact is when the reputational damage leads to things like sustained stock price dips or, as you say, millions having to be shaved off a sale price.
So You've touched on a really interesting point, and it's visibility on the share price dip. So, listed companies, God bless them, at least we can see, right? Immediately you can see, oh, look, there's a dip in the price. Or, the sale of Yahoo to Verizon. Oh, what? 350 million wiped off. But not all companies operate like that, and not all of them have the same disclosure requirements. And if you're looking at big private companies who perhaps have suffered like data breaches or ransomware attacks, we have no visibility on the amount of clients that they hemorrhaged, the people who just won't touch them, the amount of commercially sensitive information that was lost. And so say for example that big law firm that was subject to that ransomware attack a couple of years ago. No, there's no visibility, there's no evidence out there, there's no academic literature on how many clients walked out, what mergers or acquisitions were tainted by information, perhaps not being able to get in a timely, time is of the essence in a lot of these transactions. And if you're, like you say, you're operationally, you grind to a halt, that is going to impact. But this is where, the absence of evidence isn't instructive for us. We can't, we can guess that, I certainly know if I was engaging a law firm and I found out that, that they had suffered a data breach, or if they weren't doing the minimum, you'd pick up your file and walk, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, what happened with Travelex is, very open, very out there. People were, from a public point of view, people were unable to access their money if they had, prepaid cards. But, reputationally from their customers, it was super obvious as well, because the customer's reputation was also being damaged at the same time. Say Tesco Bank, I think, was one of the ones involved. They weren't able to service their customers because their service provider, Travelex, was just down and out. So, I guess that's almost kind of like a double impact from the kind of very corporate side, and also from the public customer side as well. So it's maybe a bit unusual in that respect.
So we've kind of, we're dancing around the place quite a bit, which is really interesting, because we're talking about reputational, but then there's the business operational, and then you're two-pronged. I would see that as now you're fighting a war on two fronts, right? So one, you've got to get everything up and running. Simultaneously, everybody that you supply to, you now have to run around and do a mea culpa, this sort of chest beating. And then I can only imagine that there's provisions in those contracts which would trigger in the event of X, we will walk away with zero liabilities and find somebody else to do it. So how many people are they supplying to that will have those provisions in that are like, look, guys, you're simply not cutting the mustard here. We're now going to have to go on and take our business elsewhere. So it's, you're operationally, you're ground to a halt. Then you're firefighting with your clients who you've badly let down. And it seems to me that it would be a showstopper.
And yeah, indeed, they've gone into administration.
So one thing I wanted to bring up is regulation, and specifically fines under regulation. Now, GDPR has massively increased the maximum fine that can be levied against companies for a preventable data breach. It's gone up to 20 million euros or 4% of annual global turnover, whichever is higher. And my feeling is that this specific part of the legislation wouldn't have been introduced if reputational damage in and of itself was enough of a deterrent to stop companies making these same mistakes and falling victim to these easy preventable data breaches.
Look, so I think that, everybody is really familiar with the fine. I'm not going to address your point of is GDPR, is the fine being introduced because reputational damage isn't painful enough? But I think that for me, the fine isn't the painful bit. Everybody's talking about the fine because, again, you can actually precisely pin down the figure. It's, you're 20 million, 4% of global annual turnover, whichever is higher. Great, now you've got a figure, and people gravitate towards that very black and white. What's more nuanced is there's a provision in GDPR, and people, if they're not terrified, it's simply because they don't know. And that is the right to private enforcement. And you don't have to have suffered any damage. So if you're the victim of a data breach, then you can sue. And we've seen.
Wow.
Yeah. And we've seen. So like we mentioned the Sony hack, there were payouts and lawsuits, because of breaches there. Yahoo, I think also, because we've mentioned them, they also ended settling out of court. That figure is not known. But I think that, number one, it's extremely painful because the legal costs are going to be eye-watering. Number two, if it's your own staff as well, you're going to have what we were talking about, your sort of dips in productivity. You have your operational issues. And then, you're then having to you're deploying resources to away from the proper business, whatever it is that you guys do, to then defend against this. And it could be really, really, I think that could be the real showstopper. And we've seen an appetite amongst some law firms that, if you input into Google, like data breach, law firms will just pop up, and it's like, oh, have you been involved in this data breach? Give us your details, and you join like the class action. So, probably in all likelihood, you're right that the reason that the fine is there is because it's reputational damage alone isn't sufficient to get people to do the right thing. But I think if you're focusing on the fine, you're focusing on the wrong thing.
So looking at this all overall, Roche, why should businesses care about reputational damage? Should they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You don't want to end up in a situation like Yahoo, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to guard against that. Assume that everything that you do, you're going to have to defend, right? So this is all about building in defensibility. Number one, if you've got a nation state actor and it's technically sophisticated and it's not reasonably foreseeable, there's your defense right there. That's it. If, however, you have something and it's a significant threat and it's well known and understood and a solution exists and it's a matter of patching or it's a matter of following the processes that you can download these templates, then that's unforgivable. And it does indicate that you are out of your depth if you're not at least doing the minimum. What we've seen, I suppose, with Equifax and a few of the others is that some have managed to survive, but where it's really impacted, it's excruciatingly painful. And you don't want to end up in, 350 million down on a sale because of it.
So the message of this podcast essentially is don't be Yahoo. Words to live by. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this week's episode, but thanks once again to RedSift's Dr. Roche Nihuama for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on Twitter @ITPro, as well as on Facebook and LinkedIn.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts to never miss an episode. And we'll be back next week with more analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Bye. The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.